Before time had a name, before the pyramids pierced the sky, before the gods fell silent, there was Egypt, not the Egypt of postcards and tour guides, but a world ruled by mystery, blood, and eternal stone. A land where pharaohs became gods, and gods could die. Where the Nile didn't just give life, it demanded it. And beneath golden sand, secrets still whisper in the bones of the forgotten. This is not a history lesson. This is a journey into the oldest enigma on Earth. Here is everything about ancient Egypt that refuses to stay buried. Part 1. The beginning in pre-dynastic Egypt. Before the gods had names, before the pharaohs carved their legacies in stone, before the Nile was revered as a god in itself, there was only silence. Not peace, not harmony, but a silence waiting to be broken. In the emptiness before Egypt, there were no kingdoms, no cities, only scattered peoples, wandering between the high cliffs and the restless riverbanks of a land that did not yet know it was holy. They lived as shadows, these first ones. They hunted, they gathered, they followed the rhythm of the flood without understanding its purpose. But time, like the Nile, does not rest. And slowly, the first beats of a civilization began to echo through the soil. We call this the pre-dynastic period, but it was no mere prelude. It was a crucible, a slow awakening of the people who would one day raise pyramids into the clouds and claim kinship with gods. The land was not yet unified. Egypt, as we call it now, was a divided serpent. Two lands, upper and lower, each with its own soul, its own breath. In the south, the upper land, lived the people of the mountains and deserts. They carved into stone, painted onto pottery, buried their dead with care. They honored the dead as if they had never truly left. In the north, the lower land, there were those of the fertile delta of the reeds and wide waters. Their life depended on the abundance of the Nile's gift. They lived close to the sea, but even closer to death. They did not yet call themselves Egyptians, but they were becoming something more than tribes. By 5,500 BCE, these scattered peoples had begun to settle, to domesticate animals, to grow barley and emmer wheat in the black silt of the Nile's banks. Tools became more refined, burial customs more elaborate, and with the dead they buried symbols, blades, combs, ivory figures, as if preparing the departed for another journey beyond sight. There was something in their bones, a knowing, a whisper in the dark. We are meant for more. This was the age of Nakata, a place and a culture that would seed the myths and meanings of millennia to come. The Nakata peoples left behind pottery painted in red and black, adorned with boats, animals, and abstract figures. Not random designs, but codes, a silent language of the spirit. It is in this age that we see the first signs of kingship, not crowns, not palaces, but the aura of order, hierarchy, rule. The notion that some among them bore the weight of divine right, that blood and starlight could mix. By 3,500 BCE, hierarchies had formed. Small kingdoms rose, especially in Upper Egypt. These proto-rulers built fortified towns, established trade routes as far as the Levant and Nubia. Gold from the deserts, incense from Punt, lapis lazuli from distant mountains. Their eyes were beginning to stretch beyond the horizon. The tools of war also evolved. Stone maces, copper blades, not merely instruments of survival, but of conquest. For even in ancient beginnings, unity does not come through peace. It comes through power. And as the upper and lower lands grew in strength, they grew in opposition. In Hierakonpolis, a southern city of the hawk god, archaeologists uncovered the tombs of powerful early rulers, their bodies buried in elaborate chambers, surrounded by exotic goods, even sacrificed servants. Their influence, it seems, reached far and wide. But it is not until the Scorpion King, no myth but a real figure, that the dream of unification began to breathe. We know him not from legend, but from fragments. A ceremonial mace head, carved with scenes of irrigations and conquest. A ruler not only of land, but of water, law, order. He is a ghost of a king, his image half erased by time, but his footsteps pressed into the mud brick path that would soon lead to Egypt's first pharaohs. And then finally Narmer. His name is carved into stone with authority. On the Narmer palette, a sacred relic, he is shown wearing both the white crown of Upper Egypt and the red crown of Lower Egypt, trampling enemies, smiting foes, watched by gods. This was no longer a land of fragments. This was Kemet, the Black Land, unified under one ruler, bound by the Nile, governed by Ma'at, the divine order of truth, balance, justice. But the scars of division never truly vanish. They sink beneath the surface, waiting, watching. So began the dynastic age, born from the ashes of the unknown. But let us not forget the ancestors in the dark, who walked before names and kingdoms. They were the first to feel the call of eternity, the first to shape the dead into something sacred, the first to lift their eyes to the stars and wonder, who are we? The journey had only just begun. Part 2, the early dynastic period in the Third Dynasty. The Nile does not forget, neither does power. After Narmer's unification, Egypt opened its eyes for the first time as one body, two lands tied by one crown. And so began the early dynastic period, around 3100 BCE, a time when the idea of kingship was no longer just sacred, it was divine. The king, Nisu Baidi, he who wears both crowns, was no longer a man. He was Horus made flesh. His word was law, his breath was order, and his every movement echoed the gods themselves. To disobey the king was not rebellion, it was desecration. This was a time of firsts, the first capitals, the first temples, the first written words carved in stone. The city of Memphis, founded near the border of Upper and Lower Egypt, became a seat of command, where the river forked and the fate of millions flowed. Hieroglyphs emerged not as art, but as magic. Not everyone could read them, only the scribes, the chosen few, who spoke to the divine through ink and reed. These early symbols etched names into eternity and gave birth to the most powerful spell an Egyptian could cast, to be remembered. It is here, in these centuries of early rule, that we see the slow crystallization of what would become the Egyptian worldview. A cycle of death and rebirth, of order and chaos, of the mortal king ascending to Osiris, god of the dead. The first and second dynasties were not peaceful. Unity, though declared, is not easily maintained. Pharaohs like Jer, Den, and Kwa ruled with both reverence and cruelty. Tombs became larger, more elaborate, filled with gold, cattle, weapons, and servants. In Abydos, these kings were buried in sacred ground, with dozens, perhaps hundreds, sacrificed to accompany them. Not out of savagery, but out of belief that in death the king would still rule and his court must follow. But shadows grew behind the throne. Toward the end of the Second Dynasty, chaos stirred. The names of kings became unclear, records broken, civil war perhaps, a struggle for power. The land once again cracked along its ancient fault lines, Upper and Lower Egypt pulling apart. And yet, as Egypt teetered, a new figure emerged. A man not merely of strength, but of vision. Djoser. He would be remembered not just as a pharaoh, but as a builder of worlds. With Djoser begins the Third Dynasty, and with it, a transformation that would defy time itself. Djoser reigned from circa 2670 BCE, and with him came the boldest idea yet, to build a tomb that reached not beneath the earth, but into the sky. A monument not to death, but to transcendence. He chose a new necropolis, Saqqara, where the desert stretched like a parchment waiting to be written upon. And he summoned a man whose name would echo forever, Imhotep. Imhotep, high priest of the sun, god Ra, physician, architect, sage, was not a king, but was revered like one. And it was he who conceived of the step pyramid, the first monumental stone structure in history. Before this, all tombs, mastabas, were flat, but Imhotep stacked 6 of them, one atop the other, in a symbolic staircase to the heavens. It was more than stone. It was a ladder to the divine. The step pyramid of Djoser rose from the desert like a challenge to death itself. Surrounded by courtyards, chapels, and labyrinthine passageways, it spoke one truth, that the king, though mortal, could ascend to eternity, and others would follow. Djoser's successors, Sekhemkhet, Kaaba, and others, tried to emulate his legacy. They experimented, bolder, riskier. Some left behind unfinished pyramids, broken or buried beneath the sand. But the seed had been planted. A pyramid was no longer just a tomb. It was a cosmic symbol, a monument to the soul's journey through judgment, chaos, and rebirth. It was in the Third Dynasty that Egypt first began to master the manipulation of limestone, the alignment of temples with celestial bodies, the architecture of the afterlife. But behind the glory, always, there were shadows. The people toiled. Thousands labored in the heat, dragging stone, bleeding for a legacy not their own. And yet, these workers were not slaves in chains. Many were artisans, stonecutters, engineers, fed by the state, honored with burial beside the great projects they served. Because in Egypt, death was not the end. It was merely another kind of life. As the Third Dynasty waned, so too did stability. The throne passed through uncertain hands. Kings ruled briefly. Some vanished from record, but Egypt had changed. The gods had been brought down to earth in stone and geometry. What began as scattered tribes beside a river had become a civilization building monuments to forever. The Nile kept flowing, the sun kept rising, and on the horizon something even more impossible was stirring. A dynasty of builders, priests, and kings would rise to attempt the unthinkable. They would try to touch the stars. Egypt stood at the edge of an awakening. Stone had begun to speak, the heavens had begun to listen, and somewhere beyond the horizon, beneath a sky as old as time, a vision took shape of pyramids not just as tombs, but as stairways for souls and monuments for gods. The old kingdom was coming, and with it, the age of the pyramids, where kings would become giants and the impossible would become stone.